Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics. In this video, I'd like to discuss how the Chancellor Rishi Sunak has gone back on his word to provide the NHS with, in his words, whatever it needs in favour of padding the coffers of the wealthy with public funds. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, in Rishi Sunak's first budget announcement as Chancellor, there were, as often there are in these budgets, good things, bad things and very ugly things. And this is going to sound like a massive piss take, but, the good things were really Labour policies that the Conservatives cancelled when they came to power and are now re-implementing. But it is actually true. For example, the Kickstart scheme to get young people into employment. It's very similar to a Labour scheme that, as I say, the Conservatives scrapped as soon as they came into power in 2010. It's also believed to be short-term. But if that turns out to be true, that'll just be the typical sort of cynical Tory ploy. They will bring it back for the next election, like they always do a few months before, and then cancel it straight after that general election. But I'm not going to go on about the budget as such, because the budget is about what the Chancellor's going to be spending. I want to really focus on something he's not going to be spending. But I might echo what some have said about, some of the ugly side to this budget. For example, his use of public money to give people money off vouchers at restaurants, which could bite him on the arse good and hard. I thought he had a little bit more intelligence than this, because if a second wave is linked in any serious way to people going out to restaurants, for example, not wearing face masks, then he's going to be in a bit of trouble because he will have encouraged this. It was also pointed out that it was mere weeks ago that Sunak was opposed to spending a few pounds a week on food vouchers for children in deep poverty for over summer. But apparently there's loads of money to do so for well-off middle-class restaurant goers, and the amount he's giving us is more than these kids in deep poverty. And I have no idea at all what he thought he was doing, pretending to be a waiter, standing over people at no distance at all, not wearing a face mask. So when the government tries to say it's people's fault for not wearing face masks, even though they're not pushing that message, people are going to point to this and go, well, you lead by example, don't you? But anyway, why the budget announcement is so important for Rishi Sunak is because when Boris Johnson is finally ousted by his party, whether that's later this year or sometime next, I cannot see it being beyond the end of next year, some have thought that perhaps Rishi Sunak might replace him. He's certainly been positioning himself for such a move. There are some obvious drawbacks for many Tory members to support him, but in his favour, he is intelligent, although it seems not politically intelligent, hard-working, meaning that he at least will read and understand his briefs. He is clued up in a way that Boris Johnson is not, and that he is pretty clean in terms of public opinion. Doesn't have his fingerprints on a load of atrocities yet. Unless, of course, Brexit goes badly south, even worse than I think it will go next year, and it's pointed out that actually he campaigned for it. Because he's not one of these people that campaign to remain and then turn their coat for political, benefit. He actually campaigned for Brexit in 2016. But part of his appeal at the moment is that people have been generally positive about his action in dealing with the coronavirus pandemic. He has adopted a number of socialist policies in order to preserve jobs. Literally the only cabinet minister to win praise. But will this still be the view now that he's showing he's no different to any other Conservative Chancellor? I mean, the pandemic came at a really good time for him politically, because despite Boris Johnson promising to spend beforehand, the Chancellor was telling cabinet ministers to slash their departments' budgets by 5%. And then the pandemic came. We were absolutely on course for the same old austerity that Johnson said would not happen under him. Then the pandemic, then the lockdown, then the furlough scheme. Now, this scheme did leave a massive hole through which millions of people fell. It wasn't as great as it could have been, but it was nonetheless a welcome move to preserve many jobs, millions even. He also promised the NHS that it would have, in his words, whatever it needs. And this is what is not happening. And I don't just mean because the government have used private companies to deliver healthcare services at this time when that money should have been given to the NHS or to at least the right providers. You know, they gave the job of testing to an accountancy firm who promptly messed up many of the tests due to dumb-arse moves like, not taking the details down of people who went for the test so they couldn't get results back to them, or even just straight up losing the results. Not a good look for a top accountancy firm if it can't account for its own results, and not very helpful to the rest of us. They gave contracts for producing PPE to firms that catch rats, and one sizable contract of tens of millions to a company that doesn't actually even employ anyone. Obviously a front for someone else. All of this when there were British and are British PPE producers exporting their products to other countries, but saying they'd have prioritised NHS orders if they'd have received any. But no, that's your usual Tory trick of diverting money away from the NHS and pretending that you've increased spending. We're going to spend this much on healthcare. Very little of it ends up in the NHS. And even when it is, you just force the NHS to use a private company. So you're giving it to the NHS, but then you're forcing them to give it to a private company so it doesn't actually get used publicly. Give a load of money to private companies, call it public spending, so that when people point out the serious underfunding of healthcare, the Tories will say, but look at all the billions we're pumping into it. The system just doesn't work. It's not for lack of government funding. It's there. The funding's there. It's just not working. So we should just sell it off and let private insurance companies deal with it. That's where this is going. Now, what this is just straight up going back on a promise. Because not only has the free parking for hospital staff now been scrapped. But we haven't got money for that, but we've got money to give people restaurant vouchers. There's no money to let medics, NHS staff park at their own workplace for free. But Sunak also refused to provide the funding needed to get hospitals in a position to even get back to normal. Remember, normal was a pretty bad position as well. The NHS needs much more funding. But to just get back to our normal, that terrible normal, where you have massive waiting lists, still needs a lot more funding because the coronavirus has put the NHS on its arse. In terms of where Cabinet stand on this, Matt Hancock is backing the NHS's claim for the minimum of £10 billion it needs just to be able to prepare for winter in its piss-poor usual way. But Boris Johnson does not. And this says it all, really, because Hancock will be judged on how well the NHS continues to cope. Really needs that money from the Chancellor. Johnson, who likes to talk a good fight about public funding, but when it actually comes down to it, he can just blame the Health Secretary if things go wrong in the NHS. That's what ministers are for, to take the blame. Part of the row concerns the private hospitals that were contracted out to help deal with the pandemic because our own public hospital service couldn't possibly have coped. It had been absolutely ravaged over the last 10 years. Now, given where the government were at the time, of course accessing private healthcare was a sensible decision. I fully supported it. But it still represented the government giving public funds to private companies for something that should have been publicly funded from the start. The only reason why it was a sensible policy is because given where the government were at that time, you can go on about blaming them for the last 10 years as much as you like. Where they were at that time, any government, if Jeremy Corbyn had won the general election, he would have had to have done the same thing. But they were dealing with a situation, and that was a solution. That's fine. But the government want to keep that arrangement going rather than allow the NHS to get more staff and beds to carry out that care for themselves. So, again, a lot of this so-called, the BBC were reporting again today about the massive amount of money that the government have put into dealing with coronavirus. But a lot of that has been wasted. Because even if you give it to a company that actually delivers the service well, which hasn't always been the case, but even when that is the case, like, for example, these private hospitals, I've no doubt that they've been providing a proper service. It still represents a less good return on that public investment than if you just did it in-house. And while we are paying private companies for these services, we are not, of course, getting that good value for public money. And the Chancellor is saying that the NHS has to reduce its waiting list, which is now well over 4 million, by using these private hospitals. Now, reports say that the Treasury is petrified that the waiting list is just going to get longer. It could double. And so Sunak wants to tie more funds to a guarantee that the waiting list will at least go down. But the chief executive of NHS England is refusing to provide that guarantee. I mean, of course, how can he? I mean, you might look at it and think, well, if you're going to get this money, you have to agree that it's going to make some sort of improvement. Yes, that's true. That's absolutely true. But to say that you'll be able to reduce waiting lists, you should be able to see that that's not possible. And the reason is because you can only guarantee that waiting lists will come down if your capacity exceeds demand. It's like if you get behind in a race, the only way you can catch up is by going faster than everyone else. The capacity has to not just match demand, exceed demand. The demand at the moment is 4 million in a waiting list, as well as all the other stuff happening. Now, here we go. The government are not investing in more capacity for the NHS. And the demand is also unpredictable because we do not know how the coronavirus pandemic will pan out of the rest of the year. It's inevitable we're going to get a second wave, and we don't know. That wave could well be likely to be much worse than the first. The demand could skyrocket. So if they make that guarantee and they're given an amount of money that assumes no second wave, and okay, we can reduce it by a bit, and then the second wave comes in, all of a sudden you can't anymore. So you'll have gone back on your guarantee, but it's not your fault. So when you have the chief medical officer also saying that he does not expect the pandemic to improve for a year at least, then the NHS cannot possibly guarantee a reduction in waiting numbers unless it genuinely gets the resources it needs. And it may be that that's actually not realistic. The best it can hope for is the government just does what it says it does and provides the NHS with what it can, what it needs, and they just do their best to cope as best they can with a ramshackle system. And battles with the Chancellor over this are hardly likely to inspire confidence, because as others have pointed out, the Chancellor did not attach his promise of more funding to the NHS on certain outcomes in the first place. So to do so now is also going back on his word. And for all the goodwill he's generated with spending promises, if he tries digging his heels on this, because the later he even leaves giving the NHS the money they need, the less they can do with it. They can't spend it overnight on what they need. They need to plan for winter. Winter's coming. Winter is coming. Those promises have to be followed through and for people to see the results. And if not, and his fingerprints are found on the wrecked NHS this winter when it's all collapsing, he'll sink his political ambitions before they even get much further, because although Boris Johnson might blame Matt Hancock will blame the Chancellor. But anyway, those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. If you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.